Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. Welcome to episode 40. We're calling this episode The Wound No One Sees. This is the beginning of a series of new podcasts that I want to try. Get into some of the details about parental alienation and some of the negativity that's out there in terms of the denigration of the concept and the people that work within the field. So I want to begin by telling you I want to start with a child that I'll call Matthew. Matthew was 8 years old when his parents' marriage ended. He had been, by all accounts, teachers, neighbors, even his pediatrician, basically said he was a warmly attached, securely developing boy. He loved both his parents. He said so frequently, with the uncomplicated directness that children possess before adults teach them otherwise. Within 18 months of the separation, Matthew refused to see his father. He did not merely resist, he did not express ambivalence or sadness, the way children in grief sometimes do. He expressed contempt. He described his father in terms that, well, when I first encountered them in the file, I recognized immediately. Oh, not because I had heard them from an 8-year-old before, but because I had heard them from his mother. The words, the cadence, even the specific grievances, they were hers, laundered through a child's mouth. What this podcast is specifically trying to do, it's a rigorous, evidence-based, and I hope accessible examination of one of the most consequential and most contested phenomenon in contemporary clinical and family law practice, parental alienation. This is a special series of podcasts organized around a specific focus. We will begin with clinical foundations, a brief review of what parental alienation is, what its behavioral markers look like, what the research literature says about prevalence and outcomes. We will trace the intellectual history, including the legacy of Dr. Richard Gardner, a psychiatrist who first systematized the phenomenon and who was rewarded for what contribution was one of the most sustained and dishonest smear campaigns in the recent history of clinical science. We'll examine the opposition seriously and in detail because arguments that appear repeatedly in the courtroom deserve to be understood and answered. We'll look at false memory, at suggestibility, at what 5 decades of research on children and testimony tell us about the mechanisms of alienation. And we'll look at where the field stands today, internationally, legally, clinically, because the picture is considerably more encouraging than it was even a decade ago. But first, we need to understand what we're talking about. And to do that, I want to stay with Matthew's case just a little longer. Matthew's story, in its broad outlines, is not unusual. That is the first thing I want you to understand, and it's not unusual at all. The specifics differ from case to case. Sometimes it's a mother who is targeted, not a father. Sometimes both parents contribute in different ways to a deteriorating dynamic. Sometimes the alienation is mild and reversible. Sometimes it is severe and absence intervention permanent. Sometimes it occurs deliberately as a conscious litigation strategy. Sometimes it occurs as a product of a parent whose own unresolved grief and terror operating below the threshold of awareness, what we might say in Freudian parlance called the unconscious. The parent does not experience or recognize harming the child. They believe they're protecting the child. That subjective experience does not change the outcome for the child. What is consistent across cases, and this is the clinical core of what Dr. Richard Gardner described beginning in the mid-80s, is a recognizable constellation of behavioral indicators in the child, what I refer to as a pattern of behavior. Gardner called it parental alienation syndrome, and we will discuss the name and its complexities in a later episode. For now, I want to describe what it looks like. The alienated child expresses a campaign against the targeted parent. The word campaign is deliberate. It is not ambivalence, not the ordinary complexity of a child's managing the grief of a parent's disillusion. It's a sustained, organized, frequently intense negativity directed at one parent. The alienated child offers rationalizations that are thin, frivolous, or frankly absurd. I sometimes like to say, including false. I hate him because he chews loudly. I don't want to see her because her house smells funny. These are actual comments, by the way, children have made to me. A child voicing genuine grievance has texture, specificity, affect that is appropriate to the complaint. An alienated child's rationalizations tend to collapse under even gentle clinical questioning. Alienated children show an absence of ambivalence. In healthy child development, even in children navigating divorce, feelings about parents are complex. Children love and are frustrated by the same person simultaneously. The alienated child presents a picture that is unnaturally clean. One parent is all good, the other parent is all bad. Object relation therapists will recognize this immediately as a splitting defense, primitive, regressive, and in a child of Matthew's age, clinically significant. Alienated children claim independent thinking. The child insists that their views are entirely their own, spontaneously generated, not influenced by the other adult. This insistence, paradoxically, is one of the more reliable diagnostic markers. It is the voice of the programming parent speaking. Alienated children extends the rejection to the targeted parent's entire family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, people who have been meaningful to the child their whole lives, they disappear. Not because the child has developed genuine grievances against each of them, but because they are associated with the targeted or rejected parent, and the association has become contaminating. Alienating children express no guilt. A child who refuses to see a parent they once loved, who announces that parent is essentially worthless, who rejects a grandparent they adored and feels nothing and is typically expressionless. In developmental terms, that absence of guilt is a red flag of the highest order. It's the foundation of psychopathic tendencies. Echoes of the alienating parent's language. This is what I noticed with Matthew. The words, the framing, the specific accusations. Children do not spontaneously generate adult legal and psychological vocabulary. When an 8-year-old uses the phrase emotionally unavailable or refers to a parent's narcissistic tendencies, we are hearing borrowed speech. We are hearing an adult's grievance through a child's mouth. And finally, what Gardner noticed, the most pathognomic indicator, meaning the most diagnostically definitive. The child's hatred of the targeted parent has no basis in actual experience of abuse or neglect. This is the critical clinical and legal distinction, and I will return to it throughout this special series. Parental alienation is not the appropriate word when a child's rejecting a genuinely abusive parent. Estranged is the correct word. A child who refuses contact with a parent who harmed them is not alienated. That child's behavior marks sense and demands protection. We never conflate these. The forensic evaluation process exists precisely to distinguish between them, and we will speak an entire episode on how to do that rigorously. What we are describing in the alienated pattern, where a child whose rejection is manufactured, whose suffering is real, make no mistake about that, the suffering is entirely real, but whose cause has been constructed by an adult who has enlisted the child, consciously or not, as a weapon in an adult conflict. Rejected parents need to understand that the alienated child still loves them, but their observable behavior is a form of adjustment and survival so that they can exist in their present world. More about this later on. Now I want to ask you a question I promised at the outset. If what I have just described is clinically recognizable, if it maps onto established developmental theory, if it appears across cultures and jurisdictions, if it has been documented in peer-reviewed literature for 4 decades, why is it still contested? Why, when a clinician raises parental alienation in a family court proceeding, does the opposing counsel sometimes produce academic articles arguing that the concept is illegitimate? Why is there a vocal faction within legal and mental health professions that work actively to exclude parental alienation from courtrooms and diagnostic manuals? The answer is not simple, and I don't want to give you a simple version of it, but I want to identify its major components. The first component is political. Parental alienation, when it was first named and systematized, arrived in a context of highly contested custody disputes in an era when feminist legal advocates were correctly and importantly fighting to have domestic violence and child sexual abuse taken seriously in family courts. Those advocates feared, and the fear was not groundless, that parental alienation would be weaponized by abusive parents to dismiss legitimate abuse disclosures. That fear has never fully receded. It's still out there. The problem within that argument, as I will demonstrate in detail later in this series, is that it conflates the potential misuse of a clinical concept with the validity of the concept itself. Any diagnostic category can be misused. Any clinical framework can be deployed dishonestly. The solution is rigorous evaluation, not clinical denial. When a physician's diagnosis is occasionally faked for insurance purposes, we don't respond by eliminating the diagnosis from medicine. The second component is personal. Richard Gardner was an iconoclast. He was also a prolific, sometimes provocative, and genuinely brilliant clinical thinker who operated outside the institutional mainstream. The attacks on his work were not purely intellectual, they were personal, and they were sustained, and they included claims that are factually false, claims that I will address directly in a later episode, because the disinformation campaign against Richard Gardner's legacy has become one of the primary obstacles to the recognition of his actual contribution. The third component is institutional inertia. This is perhaps the least dramatic explanation, but in some ways the most important. The history of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry is littered with the remains of ideas that were correct, documented, and resisted. Not out of bad faith, but because paradigms protect themselves. Ignaz Emanuel Weiss demonstrated in 1847 that physicians who washed their hands before delivering babies could dramatically reduce maternal mortality. He was dismissed, ridiculed, and he died in an asylum. The germ theory that vindicated him came decades later. Barry Marshall drank a solution of a solution infected with a bacteria to prove that stomach ulcers were caused by bacteria rather than stress, an idea so contrary to accepted belief that no institutional pathway existed to take it seriously. He won the Nobel Prize in 2005. We will examine this case and others in a later episode because the pattern they represent is directly relevant to the treatment of parental alienation science. The history of inconvenient science is the history of resistance, followed eventually by vindication. The question is always how long the resistance costs the people who needed the truth to be known. The fourth component, and I will say this carefully because I do not want to be misunderstood, is the phenomenon of false memory and suggestibility. One of Freud's most significant and most consequential intellectual reversals, the one I consider the most rigorous act of science self-correction, was his revision of the seduction theory. In 1896, Freud proposed that the neuroses he observed in his patients were uniformly the result of actual childhood sexual abuse. By 1897, he had revised this position, recognizing that what his patients reported and what they had experienced were not necessarily identical. That sophisticated clinical interpretation requires holding that distinction. I'm not raising this to diminish the reality of child sexual abuse, which is a genuine and serious harm that forensic evaluators must take with absolute seriousness. I am raising it because the principle it embodies is directly relevant to alienation. Children's stated memories, beliefs, and disclosures can be shaped by adult influence. This is not a controversial statement in the research literature. It is one of the most replicated findings in developmental psychology. Elizabeth Loftus' work on memory malleability, the lessons of the McMartin preschool case, the research on interviewer suggestion effects, all of this points toward the same conclusion, that a child's sincere and detailed report does not by itself establish the historical reality of what is reported. The child's not lying. The child's not performing. The child has been shaped by repeated exposure, by emotional pressure, by the ordinary and profound mechanisms of a child's dependence on parental love and approval. They have been shaped into someone who experiences a manufactured reality as their own. The tragedy is not that they are deceiving us. The tragedy is that they have been deceived. I want to end this foundational portion of this episode with a clear statement of where the research and the institutions stand, because the picture is different and more solid than the ongoing controversy might suggest. Parental alienation as a clinical phenomenon is recognized in the peer-reviewed literature across psychology, psychiatry, and family law. The American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 includes a number of diagnoses that also encompasses the alienating behavior. Legal recognition is growing in jurisdictions across Europe, Latin America, and the United States. Did you know that parental alienation is encoded in the criminal code in Brazil? Jennifer Harman and her colleagues at Colorado State University have produced some of the most methodologically rigorous research to date. Their work, published in peer-reviewed journals beginning in 2016, estimates that approximately 22 million Americans have experienced parental alienation. That's not a fringe phenomenon. That is a public health reality. Amy Baker's longitudinal research on adult survivors of parental alienation documents the long-term psychological consequences: depression, compromised identity formation, relationship difficulties, and a distinctive pattern of grief that Baker has characterized as mourning, a parent who is physically present but psychologically unavailable. The opposition literature, which has been widely cited in courtrooms by those seeking to discredit alienation claims, has been subjected to rigorous methodological critique. We will examine such studies and those critiques in detail in a later episode. The short version is this. Most studies, sampling, and methodology do not support the broad conclusions that they have drawn from them, and the response literature from Harman, Lorandos, and others makes this case with considerable precision. The clinical reality of parental alienation is not under serious scientific dispute among researchers who have examined the full evidentiary record. What is disputed, and what will continue to be disputed in courtrooms until a more uniformly educated bench exists, is how to evaluate it, how to weigh it against competing claims, and what interventions are warranted. In other words, teach both legal and mental health professionals the recognizable pattern the phenomenon presents in virtually every case. Those are important questions. They are the questions that this podcast is built on to address. Before I close this episode, I want to speak directly to two different groups of people who may be listening. The first group is professionals, attorney, judges, mental health clinicians, custody evaluators, who encounter parental alienation in your work and are looking for a rigorous research-grounded framework for understanding it. This series is designed with you in mind. The clinical and forensic literature is extensive and, frankly, difficult to navigate under the time pressures of professional practice. I will do the navigating for you. I will give you the primary literature, the methodological disputes, and the practical frameworks for evaluators and testimony. My goal is that you finish this series better equipped to serve the children and families who come before you. The second group is parents. If you are a parent who is living through alienation, who has watched your child be turned against you, who sits in a family court trying to explain something that feels unspeakable, who has been told by people who should know better that what you are experiencing is not real or not recognized or not serious, I want you to hear this clearly. What you are experiencing has a name. It has been documented. There are clinicians who understand it, researchers who study it, and courts that are increasingly equipped to address it. You are not alone, and you are not wrong. I also want to say this, because it matters. The fact that what you are experiencing is real does not mean that every case of alleged parental alienation is what it appears to be. Rigorous evaluation protects everyone, including you. The goal of this work is never to win a custody case. The goal of this work is to serve the child. And the most important thing I can tell you is that there are two objectives when the evaluation is done right and are not in conflict. Matthew, the boy I told you about at the start of this episode, he is a composite. His details are drawn from multiple cases, altered to protect confidentiality, as all clinical narratives in this series will be. But the clinical picture he represents is real. The injury he represents is real. And the children like him who are sitting in rooms right now, having been taught to hate a parent who loves them, they are real. This series is for them, ultimately, even if they are never in its audience. In Episode 2, we will build the clinical and theoretical foundations in earnest. We will examine the full taxonomy of parental alienation, the behavioral indicators, the severity levels, the alienating behaviors, and we will introduce the intellectual lineage that runs from Sigmund Freud through John Bowlsby, through Margaret Mailer to Richard Gardner. A lineage that tells us something important about how and why parental alienation works, because it exploits precisely the developmental architecture that defines a child's earliest and most consequential relationships. The next episode is Naming the Unnameable. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.deniers.org. www.drobovans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.